Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 31, Episode 18. Coming up on this show, we've got the Psychic Polygraph, Revenge of the Lost Soul, and Bibhu Dev Misra joins us to discuss his new book, Yuga Shift, the end of the Kali Yuga and the impending planetary transformation. I'm your host, Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wright.
I'm looking forward to this interview with Bibhu because you were telling me a little bit earlier that he may possibly have found the date for when we go through the next shift.
He has. He's cracked it. And I'm just going to put it out there. It's March 2025.
So does he explain in the interview what happens on March 2025?
Yeah, we go into everything. And Bibhu is one of my favorite writers. He writes for Mysterious Universe, of course. It's nearly 2 years now since he's been writing articles for us. And he's just fantastic at digging into ancient mysteries, ancient civilizations. He's written some really brilliant articles for us over these past couple of years. And the book came out in December last year, and I've been promising him that I would get him on for an interview, but it's just been so difficult with our setup.
Oh, there's technical things like, yeah.
I have to move everything around for an interview and then move it back. I just don't want to do that.
Love that.
Just don't want to do that.
I don't want to move a couple of cameras and a couple of lights.
It's a pain in the bum.
It's just too much effort.
So we interviewed him in Studio B, which is my house.
Perfect.
And went really well. It was a great chat with Bibhu. I hope you enjoy it. The new book, Yuga Shift, is available now. Here it is on the screen here. And we go into everything. The date, what's coming. What do you think's coming, Aaron?
I'm hoping a golden age, but am I wrong?
We're fair way away from the golden age.
Well, we don't need any more downturn. It's already pretty bad. Like, does it get worse?
Yes. Ant people are coming up. We're going to be talking about ant people, the ancient Greeks.
All right.
Yeah, it's going to be good. Make sure you check out the book, Yuga Shift. You can find Bibhu at bibhudevmisra.com. And you might not know, Bibhu has been an engineer for years, and he worked for the World Bank, and he worked for...
no wonder he knows when the Kali Yuga is going to end.
Yeah, he's got all the inside info. But it was about a few years ago where he just said, I'm done. I'm just going to research ancient mysteries, ancient civilizations full-time. And so this book is really the result of that. We hope you enjoy the interview with Bibhu Dev Misra. We're welcoming Bibhu Dev Misra to the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Bibhu. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Ben. It's nice to be here and talk to you about the book and so many other things.
Well, it's just great to see you because you've been writing for us for nearly 2 years now. And it's great to see your face and finally touch base because we've mostly just been emailing each other, haven't we?
Sure, yeah. And this is the first time that I'm looking at you as well because I couldn't find your face anywhere on MU.
What, you haven't been watching our YouTube videos?
No, I don't. I didn't know that there was a YouTube channel.
Bibhu, come on. Well, the book is fantastic. Of course, we're here to talk about Yuga Shift. And I want to talk about how long this has been in the works because I remember first coming across your work, and I think it was on New Dawn magazine. They had a copy of your article, which was on the Kali Yuga, and you were calculating this possible timeline of the Kali Yuga. And I remember just being so impressed with your work. I thought, this is someone who's been seriously looking at this for a long time. And I learned that article is nearly a decade old now. So it made me think, how long have you been looking into this? How many years in the works has Yuga Shift been?
Well, the first article came out in 2012, and I probably started working on the Yuga cycle around 2010 because that was the time there was a lot of talk about the Mayan calendar ending in 2012, and I wanted to figure out what the Hindu texts tell about the ending of the Kali Yuga. So I worked on that timeline. I found out that there are a number of errors which came into the text over a period of time. And I started to iron them out. Also by looking at a number of other cultures, because the Yuga cycle is not a concept that is unique to Indians. It's a concept that is common to the entire world. Every ancient culture thought of a cyclical pattern of history and not the linear pattern of history that we talk about in mainstream science today. So I came up with this article in 2012 and I found out that the Kali Yuga ends in 2025. That was still comfortably a long distance away but it's not so anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's right down It's right next year.
And so for those who are perhaps new to this topic, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about a yuga? Can you talk about this grand cycle, what it means within the Sanskrit sources, and also the divisions within that cycle?
Yeah, when the ancients talked about the past, they told us that human consciousness and human civilization, they actually move in a cyclical manner. So there are times when human consciousness becomes so elevated and so purified that we are in a golden age, and which is called the Satya Yuga in Sanskrit. Satya means truth. So it's the age of truth. And in the age of truth, every person's mind is pure. And the reason his mind is pure is because he's aware that every person is divine at the source. So we have something called a soul or a self within us. And when you are able to tap into that self or the soul, then you are basically tapping into the essence of the creator. And so any person who does that, he radiates the joy and the love and the wisdom and the truthfulness of the creator. So that was the whole idea of the golden age, that every person is saintly, every person is spiritually elevated. And when you have a large population where everybody is at a high state of consciousness, obviously that particular society is going to live in a state of a perfection and bliss, and there's not going to be the kind of evils and violence and war and discord that you see in the world today. And in the golden age, the environment also reflected that state of consciousness back to humanity. So an environment was pure, there was abundance, biodiversity, and they were not, you didn't have the kind of natural calamities and catastrophes or even diseases that you have today. And all of this is backed up by science, by the way. I mean, this is not just a utopian scenario that the ancients made up, because when I started investigating, I found that the data that we have about the past reflects all of these characteristics of the yugas.
Yeah, and when you're talking about advancements, I want to go into what the Satya Yuga fully entails a little bit later, but you're right. I love some of these scientific correlations between the Sanskrit sources. I want to get into them later, especially this incredible stuff you found on cranial volume and things like that. And so shifting out of that, there's a change, isn't there? There's like a decline into the next age.
Yeah. So from the Satya Yuga, we move to the next stage, which is the Treta Yuga, which is in the Greek sources, that's the Silver Age. Then we move to the Dwapara Yuga, which is the Bronze Age in the Greek sources. And finally, you end up in the Kali Yuga, or the Iron Age, which is the age that we are living in right now. And throughout this process, there's a decline of our consciousness. There's a movement away from truth. And as a result, that manifests in a lot of social evils. So this process has been going on for the last 12,000 odd years, this devolution of human consciousness, and along with it, the degradation of the environment and many other characteristics like our physical size and our cranial volume.
Well,
and all of that.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because you're right. There is this underlying spiritual and moral quality that is really the foundation of the decline. But that seems to be reflected in so many other things. For example, you talk about not only technology in the Satya Yuga, in the Golden Age, but the idea that the technology might not even be needed because individuals in the Satya Yuga may have the siddhis, or supernormal abilities, we might call them today. And then other things like the lifespan and the health of people, the lack of disease and the superior strength. Can you speak a little bit about what we know from the Sanskrit sources about those kinds of reflections? What appears in that way?
Yeah, for instance, in the Sanskrit sources, they tell us that people in the Golden Age, they lived for, the average lifespan was around 400 years. And that's kind of backed up by the biblical sources as well, where we hear that the people, in the antediluvian times, they had lifespans of around 900 years, 800 years. And that gradually came down to around 150 years during around 1500 BCE. So there has been a gradual decrease in our lifespan, and that is reflected in the Sanskrit texts also, where we find that the lifespan came down from 400 years in the Golden Age to around 100 years in the Kali Yuga or the Iron Age.
And physical size and strength is another one as well.
Yeah, right. And they tell us that the people in the higher yugas were really big and strong, and that's reflected in the science. Because what we have found out now is that our average physical size has declined by around 10% over the last 12,000 odd years. So a 10% reduction, and 10% is actually, I think, underestimation, because there's a tendency within the scientific circles to reject a lot of big skeletons as anomalous, and so that they don't factor those really big skeletons into their calculations. So it might not be 10%, it could actually be 20 or 25% reduction in physical size.
I remember about 4 or 5 years ago on Mysterious Universe, we covered a book. I've forgotten the author's name, but the focus was on, it wasn't even that ancient. It was sources going back to ancient Greece, perhaps 500 BC, and he had produced all the recordings of the physical feats of ancient Greek soldiers and the strong men of the era. And one that stuck out was an old story of Greek rowers. They were in a warship and they were trying to row, to beat another navy to an island. And if you look at the time it took them to do it, it's just inconceivable that men would be able to row that fast. But when you put it in the context of the gradual decline of not only the moral and spiritual foundations of people, but also their actual physical capabilities, it starts to make sense that the ancients were faster, they were stronger, they were smarter, they were literally bigger. And I loved this mention. You kind of touched on this just very briefly. You spoke about, from the Sanskrit sources, the king Raivata, who travels to the celestial court to find a groom for his daughter. But can you go into that in just a little bit more detail? Because it kind of nods to this idea of like some kind of space travel, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, Vimanas are mentioned in so many places in the ancient Indian texts. And this particular story is about a king who lived in the golden age of the Satya Yuga, and he's called King Raivata. And he wanted to find a suitable groom for his daughter, and he was not able to find anybody on earth. So he traveled in a spaceship to the celestial court of Brahma, who lives, in the heavens somewhere. And there he was waiting for Brahma to finish listening to a particular musical performance. So he just waited there for some time, and after the musical performance is over, he goes to Brahma and tells him, can you find me a suitable groom for my daughter? And Brahma then tells him that this few minutes that you are waiting in my court, already there's a cycle of 4 ages has passed on earth.
Oh, wow.
So it's no longer the golden age on earth. Right now, it's the Dwapara Yuga. And right now, there are a couple of divine entities called Krishna and Balarama who have incarnated on earth. So you might go back to the earth and confer the hand of your daughter on Balarama, who was a big and powerful warrior of the Dwapara Yuga, and the brother of Krishna, who was the manifestation of Vishnu, the creator. And so he goes back, and then when he goes back to earth, he finds that the stature of men, the physical size has declined, the energy has decreased, and the intelligence and their consciousness has also declined. And he says there in the text that he was surprised to come back to earth and find the kind of devolution that has happened in those few minutes that he spent at the court of Brahma.
That's fascinating.
And then, so there are two really interesting aspects. First is, of course, the decline in our size and our mental and spiritual abilities. And the second is time passes differently in different dimensions. So like 5 minutes in the dimension of Brahma is equivalent to an entire Yuga cycle of around, maybe not an entire, maybe 3/4 of a Yuga cycle spanning around 9,000 years on Earth. And this is something that scientists are talking about right now, that time is not fixed. And on different star systems, time can pass a lot more slowly than on Earth.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It brings up the idea of, as you said, time dilation. And now we're dipping our toes into the idea of different dimensions of existence where time flows in a different way. It was fascinating that you mentioned that religion wasn't required in the Satya Yuga. Why is this?
Well, as I mentioned, that the entire religion of Satya Yuga consisted of the identification of our self with the universal self. So that's what we call as self-realization. When we understand that the divinity which is within you is also the essence of the Creator. So that was the whole religion. The path towards self-realization was the whole religion of Satya Yuga. And it was not necessary for people to perform any kind of religious acts or rituals like we do now. Those came up in the later yugas as men moved away from the path of truth, from as a lot of egoic desires came up in our mind. What happens is that the mind becomes clouded by a lot of egoic desires, greed and lust and selfishness. And once that comes up, it becomes very difficult for you to tap into your inner source. You go farther and farther away from your inner source, move away from the state of peace and contentment and love and joy. And then you become anxious. And now you want to achieve so many things. You want to acquire so many things, and you've gone far away from your source. So that's when the religious rituals come up, and you think that maybe by performing these kind of rituals, I'll be able to attain the object of my desire. So that started in the Treta Yuga or the Silver Age. And as we moved farther and farther away from the truth, the number of rituals also multiplied. And in the Kali Yuga, it just turned into a big business because now, these rituals don't actually earn you any kind of results, because not only have we moved very far away from the source, the dimensions, the contact between the different dimensions also kind of closed up in the Kali Yuga.
Yeah.
So the gods.
Well, I was going to say, it's intriguing. You mentioned in those Sanskrit sources, there's a color of the soul that changes over time as well. It's I can't remember the specifics, but it's clear. And in the Golden Age, by the time we get to the Kali Yuga, the age we're in today, the color of the soul is described as being black. And for me, that's a fascinating metaphor. I also probably think it's a real tangible thing in another dimension, but it does reflect that people can't see through the Kali Yuga age. We can't penetrate into the truth of the cosmos. We are literally clouded in these black clouds. Like the color of the soul is black.
One of the things that you find out when you read about the ancient legends in almost every culture, that the gods and the sages and the spirits used to interact with humans in the higher yugas, and they used to pass on not only the skills of civilization, but they used to pass on a lot of wisdom, which helped us to improve our moral standards. And sometime at the beginning of the Kali Yuga, those contacts kind of closed off. The interdimensional contacts no longer happened. Maybe it happens sporadically, but not necessarily with the gods, but with different kind of spirit beings who inhabit possibly the subterranean regions of the earth. And so once these dimensional contacts closed up, over a period of time, they turned into myths and legends. And people started thinking that, the people of the ancient times probably made up these stories. Which kind of doesn't make sense, because why would any person give the credit for his own discoveries to others? If people in the higher ages actually invented mathematics and science and astronomy and architecture, they would have taken the credit for it themselves, but they never did. They said that all of this was given to us, and we are merely following what has been given to us.
It's a great point. And now we're kind of circling down into the age we're in today, the Kali Yuga. Let's just quickly talk about the attributes. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this because it's obvious for a lot of people. We know that civilization is declining. We know that moral and spiritual qualities are declining, and the traditional values are completely inverted. But speak a little bit to it if you can. What are the attributes that are in those old sources of the Kali Yuga?
What they basically tell us is that in the Kali Yuga, because of the increase in our materialistic desires, and the fact that our minds also become highly reduced, we don't have the memory of our ancient ancestors. We don't have the intellect. So when there's an increase of materialistic desires, and we also fall away from truth, we are willing to pursue any kind of action to fulfill our desires. So that's what leads to the burgeoning of evil in the society. Wars and discord and violence and cheating and lying and corruption. These are all manifestations of the egoic desires without any moral compass. And that's what's happening. And that's what's happening in the Kali Yuga.
You had a great quote in your book. You said, might will be right, war will be peace, greed will be God, hatred will be love, honesty will be a character flaw, and wisdom will be akin to treason. We seem to almost be there right now. And I think most of us would agree with you. But we'll get into some of that a little bit more if we have time. I want to talk about more attributes of the Kali Yuga, but let's take a little bit of a sidestep because I want to talk about these connections. Obviously, we have the Sanskrit sources, which are tremendously old, but let's get into the other cultures around the world that have similar cycles of ages. As you said at the start, this is not exclusively an Indian concept. So let's talk about the Greeks, for example. Did they have a cycle of the ages? Did they have similar divisions of the ages within this grand cycle?
Yeah, the Greeks called it the Great Year. That was the most common term, but there were other terms in use as well. And the terms that they used for the yugas were golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages. And the first and the most detailed description of the ages of man in Greek literature was documented by Hesiod, the poet Hesiod, in the 6th century BCE. And the way he describes the ages of man is fascinatingly similar to the Hindu descriptions. So in the Golden Age, people lived like the gods on earth, and they had everything that they wanted, and there were no diseases and no warfare of any sort. But with the Silver Age, people started becoming more violent, and they started disrespecting the gods. And this continued in the Bronze Age, where there was a lot of fighting. And it was in the Bronze Age that the gods actually started moving away from the earth. And there's a Greek poet who talks about the god called Dike, who was the goddess of justice. And she's so appalled by the behavior of the people in the Bronze Age that she leaves the earth and flies away. And then finally, you have the Iron Age, where there's discord and disrespect. People don't respect their parents, and they kind of they respect only the evildoers, and the wise people are basically ignored or even insulted. So the description of the Iron Age in Hesiod's text is extremely similar to the Sanskrit text about the Kali Yuga.
Yeah, again, the trend is that everything is inverted, everything is reversed. Truth is deceit, and simplicity turns into greed. I found it fascinating, that detail that the gods were leaving, that this was explicitly stated. You talked about the final gods to leave. There were two final gods that left humanity behind. I think it was Eidos and Nemesis were the last gods to depart. They left during the Iron Age, so the final age. But what did those gods represent? What were they responsible for in human beings?
Yeah, Eidos was the goddess of modesty, and her presence on earth ensured that we don't break the moral codes of conduct. And Nemesis was the goddess who provided retribution for any kind of evil actions.
Wow.
So if Eidos leaves, then people start breaking the moral codes. And if Nemesis leaves, it means even if you break the moral codes, there's nobody there to punish you for your actions anymore. And that's what the Kali Yuga is about. It's an open playing field for the forces of evil, and there's very little that you can do about it, because the divine forces which actually regulate these cycles, they actually leave us during the Kali Yuga, and it ultimately comes upon us as human beings to do something about it. And unfortunately, most people are too scared or too meek to stand up against the kind of evil.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a saying in Buddhism that in the Dharma ending period, there'll be no Dharma to guide the people. And the Dharma, of course, is the law. And when the law leaves, it's up to people to figure out the law themselves. There's nothing for them to follow. And people, you see this, people start to compare themselves with the standards around them rather than the higher standard of the Dharma. So you can see how it's just this snowball effect of a decline. When people start to compare themselves to an already declining standard generation after generation, it's so easy to see how it can fall into ruin. Well, let's shift a little bit to North America now, because we have the Sioux people of North America. And you found this really fascinating correlation in that the Sioux tribe, they have a metaphor for the ages of a buffalo standing on its four legs. And in the golden age, it's on four legs. The next age, it's on three legs. And by the time they get to the final age, it's just wobbling on one leg, ready to collapse. And wasn't there a correlation directly with the Sanskrit sources that there's a bull or a buffalo on four legs?
Yeah, we call it the bull of dharma. And in the Satya Yuga or the golden age, the bull of dharma, it stands on four legs, which basically refers to the completeness of truth. So truth is complete in the Satya Yuga, and that's why the bull stands on four legs. And on each of the yugas, it loses one of its leg. So in the Kali Yuga, the bull of dharma is standing on only one leg. And as we go towards the end of this yuga, even this leg is going to fall apart, and there's not going to be any dharma left in the world. And by dharma, I mean righteousness, good conduct in accordance with the cosmic laws. And what the Sioux people say is that right now their buffalo has lost all its hairs and is standing on the last leg, and they actually expect the end of this current cycle to be around the corner as well.
Really? And what's their apocalypse event? What do they expect to happen when the buffalo falls?
They expect a flood. I mean,
Okay.
they say that the buffalo is basically holding off the flood, and when it collapses, the waters are going to come in, and it's going to submerge and destroy everything. And a new cycle is going to begin after that.
And staying in the same region, you had a wonderful piece on the Hopi tribe and the correlations there as well, because they talk about the various worlds. What I find so fascinating about the Hopi cosmology is they talk about the interim periods as well and how they kind of escaped each transition of the ages. So can you speak a little bit about the Hopi beliefs and how it correlates with the ages of the yugas?
Yeah, the Hopi talk about four different worlds: the first world, the second world, third, and the final world, which we're living in right now. And in each of these worlds, when things started off, they were very nice and pure, and people were living in peace and harmony and joy. But as the yuga or the age progressed, they started devolving into more and more materialistic desires, and discourse and wars started off. So every age kind of ends in a cataclysmic event. It could be frost or fire or earthquakes or volcanoes. So it could be any of those, but there's always a cleansing or purification that happens at the end of a particular world of the Hopi, which correlates to what the Sanskrit texts tell us, that the end of a yuga is followed by a period of pralaya, which basically means universal dissolution. So this is something that we also find in all the other texts, that there's always a period of purification at the end of a yuga. And the interesting part about the Hopi is that some of the righteous people are always saved. They are guided to an underground location, which they call as the home of the ant people.
Love it.
And ant people are fascinating. And they say that they are taken to this underground location, and it's beautifully lighted up. There's a lot of food and whatever they need for survival. It's all kept there. And it's after that the world is totally destroyed and recreated again, that they're again brought out of that shelter, underground shelter.
It's so interesting that the new world, even as it's declining through the ages, the new world is always bright and beautiful and all cleaned up. But they're told, oh, it's just slightly worse. It's just like they notice it's just slightly not as good as the previous age.
Yeah, that's right. And so when they come out again, they're given the new set of laws for the new world by their creator god, who's called Sotaknang. And that's how it goes on. And the interesting thing about the ant people is that they seem to correlate with the legends of the dwarves or the gnomes that we find in other cultures, because they live in an underground location. They're very skillful, and they have a lot of wealth, because the dwarves are supposed to be the custodians of the wealth of the world.
It's incredible. You have this connection to European folklore. It's got all the same elements, but you found a linguistic connection. I think it was to the Mayan word for dwarves as well, didn't you? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Mayans also actually believed in this race of dwarves. And when you look at the Mayan inscriptions and their relief carvings, you see that the Mayan kings actually interact with the dwarves. The dwarves used to be an important component of the Mayan court, because they were highly prized for their knowledge and their wisdom, and most importantly, for the clairvoyance. They could actually see into the future. And many of these Mayan books of prophecies, like the Book of Chilambalam and other books of prophecies, they were supposedly composed by these dwarfs. And the Mayan word for dwarf was Zaya Muin Kob. I mean, this is written by a highly esteemed scholar of Mesoamerican archaeology. He says that the Mayans call them Zaya Muin Kob, which basically translates into ant-men. So they basically use the same terminology as the Hopi.
That's
to refer
fascinating.
to this race of dwarfs.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What an incredible link. Yeah, because when we've spoken about it in the past, it's always tempting to think in very extreme terms about what Ant-Man actually means. Like, is it some kind of alien? Like, what is actually going on? Is it some kind of monster person? But when you tie it into the linguistic connection to dwarves and how it connects to European folklore, you start to get a clearer picture of what might be going on. Well,
right. And the other interesting thing is that the dwarves supposedly created or at least helped the Mayans to create the ancient cities.
Really?
Yeah, and he also mentions an interesting thing, that the dwarves had the ability to whistle, and as a result of that, the stones would automatically move through the air and land at the right location.
Oh.
So, which kind of ties in with what a lot of Arabic scholars said about places like, some of these large constructions at Baalbek, Lebanon, for instance. Some of the Arabic scholars said that it was built by the jinns by using their magical powers to levitate those large blocks of stone.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, the whistles, the old little dwarves whistling the blocks into place. Yeah, I love that. That whole section in your book was amazing. But let's talk about some of the dating we get from the other sources, because, of course, when we're thinking about an ancient advanced civilization, Atlantis comes to mind, obviously, and then we can go to Solon and his conversations with the Egyptian priests, and that really gives us a date, doesn't it? Because Atlantis was said to have been destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's time, so now we've got a ballpark, 9,600 BCE. Is that something you use to work on your method of dating?
Yeah, sure. Because what happened in the ancient Indian texts is that the Yuga cycle was multiplied by 360, and it turned out into a humongous number of around 4 million,
4.3 million.
Yeah, 4.3 million years cycle, which doesn't obviously make sense in the context of our known history of the human civilization, nor does it tie up with the duration of the Yuga cycles in the other cultures. Because wherever we look, we find a Yuga cycle of around 12,000 years. The Greeks had 12,900 years and 10,800 years. The Etruscans had 12,000 years. The Persians had a 12,000-year cycle. And even in some Hindu texts, like the Laws of Manu or the Mahabharata, you still have a cycle duration of 12,000 years. It's just in some Puranas where it was multiplied by 360 and it turned into this huge number. And since the Puranas became very popular with the people because they contain so many stories about the past, that became the de facto standard for the Yuga cycle. And a lot of Indians still believe that the Kali Yuga is going to run into 400,000 odd years. And they don't think that the end of the Kali Yuga is really very close at hand, which doesn't make sense in the context of the other cultures.
Yeah, you go into a lot of detail on breaking these factors down. It might be too broad for this interview, but briefly, that was all about the divine year, wasn't it? Some kind of miscalculation on the divine year, which was 360, and they're doing this massive calculation based on that. But yeah, when you pair it with the other sources, like you mentioned there, what was it? The Etruscans, 12,000 years, the Persians, 12,000 years. Cicero talked about 12,900 years. So it makes so much more sense. And another interesting detail that you uncovered, well, actually, it's not you just kind of brought this into the bigger picture, was the idea that the descending cycle is actually doubled. So it's like, please explain this, because we go through 2 Kali Yugas, which I thought was really unfair. Like, we go through 2 of these periods of just absolute decline and horrendous circumstances. Why is that? Why is there 2 Kali Yugas in this cycle?
Yeah, this was actually first brought up into notice by Sri Yukteswar, who wrote a book called The Holy Science, and where he said that there were two cycles. There's a descending cycle of 12,000 years when there's a devolution of consciousness and virtue declines. And this is followed by an ascending cycle of 12,000 years where our consciousness gradually evolves until we reach the peak of the next golden age. So these two cycles add up to a complete cycle of 24,000 years. That's the complete Yuga cycle. And yeah, that's the one.
I've got it on the screen
And
here. Yeah, descending down. So it's
right,
like you're taking two halves of the 12,000 years and joining them together to get this full
right.
cycle.
24. And the reason why it makes a lot of sense is because in every cycle, time cycle that we find in nature, you find that the light gradually decreases and then gradually increases. So in the 24-hour cycle of day and night, you find that the light is gradually increasing from 12 midnight to 12 noon, and then there's a gradual decline. There's no abrupt transition from a golden age to a dark age or from a dark age to a golden age. Similarly, in the cycle of seasons, I mean, the intensity of light gradually increases from winter to summer, and then there's a gradual decline. So the Yuga cycle should also be similarly constructed or envisioned in terms of two cycles where there's a descending cycle which is followed by an ascending cycle of virtue. And it's also very close to the precession cycle of the Earth in terms of its value, because the Earth's precession cycle is 25,800 years.
Yeah. We're getting close now,
and
aren't we? That's almost aligning.
Yeah, and 25,800 years. So there's still a discrepancy, and I kind of found out the reason for that discrepancy while researching on the book. And so the model that I have in the book has a 25,800 year Yuga cycle. We'll come to that later. But I started off with the 24,000 year cycle, and that's what I wrote about in my initial article, that it's a 24,000 year cycle, and we are now about to end the Kali Yuga in 2025. And you spoke about the descending and the ascending Kali Yuga. So what happens is that as we are moving down this cycle, there are two Kali Yugas, which back-to-back Kali Yugas. The first one is the Kali Yuga in the descending cycle. The next one is the Kali Yuga in the ascending cycle. Now, that tends to give you the impression that since we are right now in the ascending Kali Yuga, it kind of gives you the impression that maybe we are in an increasing cycle of virtue or the increasing cycle of consciousness.
Yeah, that means things are going to get better, right? We're on the way up. We're coming out of it.
Yeah.
So what's going on, Bibhu? Why is there demons everywhere?
Yeah, the problem is that as long as you're in the Kali Yuga, our consciousness is always declining. You're not yet out of this declining cycle of consciousness. What happens in the ascending cycle is that there's an increase in material prosperity. And that is something that you do see around us over the last 500 or 6,000 or maybe 1,000 years. The state of material prosperity, or at least in some parts of the world, the material conditions of life has improved, although that's not true for every part of the world. And what also happens in the Kali Yuga is that your lifespan increases a little bit. For instance, if you go back around 2,000 years, our average lifespan was around 54, 55 years. And from there, it has now increased to around 80 years. So there has definitely been an increase in lifespan. And there's also been a slight increase in our physical size. We have increased by at least around 2 or 3 centimeters in physical size on an average across the world in the ascending Kali Yuga. So now if you're living longer and you're becoming slightly bigger, then you can work more, you can acquire more wealth. So that is what has been happening in the Kali Yuga, the increase in our material prosperity.
So it's an increasing discrepancy between the spiritual and moral foundation and the actual material desires and material acquisitions. That gap is just getting wider and wider and wider. Well, I also heard a skeptical argument against this, saying that, well, isn't our increase in technological capabilities the perfect example of how we're coming out of it, how things are actually improving? What would you say to that?
Well, technology, I think, is kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it does provide us opportunities to improve our understanding of the universe, our understanding of the ancient past of humanity. And it helps us to communicate over longer distances, travel and see new places. So that obviously helps you to enhance your consciousness. But is technology used by every person in a responsible manner? No, I mean, a lot of technology is actually used for a lot of evil and despicable purposes. War and violence being one of them, and enslavement of humanity, and all of these transnational, the financial dealings that take place across the world. So all of that is also very, it's not really good for our society. And we also know that technology is very harmful to our environment. That's everybody knows that. And it also, with the onset of social media, there's also an onset of depression and frustration for a lot of people. So it's also not affecting us very positively at the level of consciousness.
Yeah, and
So it's both.
it's a funny one. Like with the way we're conversing now, as miraculous as it is, there's something very inhuman about it. I mean, it's not a normal human way for people to converse and interact. We have all these layers of technology in between us. And one of the amazing things that you mentioned is we remind ourselves that the idea in the golden ages is that this technology wouldn't be necessary. We might be able to connect with each other through our minds across vast distances instantaneously, and there's also in the cities, of course, in the supernormal abilities, there's teleportation, there's all sorts of incredible abilities described. So it's almost like the technological advances in the latter ages are trying to replicate some of the innate supernormal abilities that human beings have that have been lost, that have atrophied.
That's true. And every yuga has its own set of technologies that are in harmony with the vibrations of that age. So the higher ages also, you had technologies that were in harmony with the vibrations of that period. And in the golden ages, it's about the empowerment of the people and not about the empowerment of machines. Right now, we are making the machines more powerful, whereas in the higher yugas, the humans themselves become more powerful. It's about the unlocking of our innate human potential. That's what the higher ages are about. It's not about using a lot of gadgets. It's about you doing supernormal things. It's about you being empowered. And when the power resides in an individual who is also spiritually elevated, it ensures that that power is not used unfairly or unjustly for selfish gains, which is what you have in the Kali Yuga, because here the technology is used in a grossly unfair manner. And so that ensures that the golden ages, the technology does not harm the people. It doesn't harm their spiritual evolution.
Well, let's talk about some of your breakthroughs with the dating and how this tied into the Saptarshi calendar. This was quite a heavy topic, but I'd like you to describe it as briefly as you can, because I think it's important to understand how you went about this. Because of course, the big puzzle we're trying to figure out, and you've already given away that you've come to this conclusion that the Kali Yuga ends in 2025. What was it, March? What's the exact date?
March 21st. It's an equinox date.
Yeah, right. March 21st, 2025. But it's actually an ingenious way to get there. How did you actually arrive at that date? How did these ancient calendar systems enable you to pinpoint such a close, specific date?
Well, first of all, I took the descending cycle, and the duration of every yuga in this cycle, according to the Persians and according to some of the Indian astronomers like Aryabhatta and others, is 3,000 years. So you basically have 3,000 into 4. That adds up to a 12,000 year descending cycle. Now, my question was, how was this cycle tracked? There must have been some kind of a calendar which was used for tracking this cycle and keeping track of the dates. And there was a calendar that was very popular in ancient India. It was called the Saptarshi calendar, or the calendar of the seven sages. Now, the seven sages are a very interesting set of personalities. You find them in so many ancient cultures, and every culture looked upon them as some kind of divine entities who came from outer space, from the stars. They're not human beings. They're very clear about that. All the texts are clear about that. They're not human beings. They are divine entities who came from the stars, and they imparted all the knowledge and wisdom to the people. And then they didn't go back to the stars. They went into the underground aquifers, the groundwater. That's where they were entered into. And it's from there that they emerge periodically at the beginning of every yuga to to repromulgate the ancient wisdom, because there's a cataclysmic event that happens at the end of a yuga. And so after, when a new yuga is beginning, these sages emerge from their underground locations and they pass on that ancient wisdom once again to the people. So in India, there was a calendar called the calendar of the seven sages, which has a 2,700 year cycle. And I thought this is brilliant, because if every yuga is of 3,000 years duration, and we have a 2,700 year cycle, which is also called a Saptarshi Yuga, it's called a Yuga, Saptarshi Yuga, then this must be the calendar
Yeah.
that was used for tracking the Yuga cycle, right? And then what about the remaining 300 years? Well, the texts also tell us that every Yuga is followed by a period of transition, which typically runs into 100 or 200 or 300 or 400 years. And I thought that this 300 years then must be the period of transition between the yugas. So you have a 2,700 year yuga, which is the actual duration of the age of man,
Yeah.
of the yuga. And then you have a 300 year period of transition at the end of the yuga. And that's how the cycle goes. And one of the starting points of the Saptashi calendar is 6,676 BCE. This is, the scholars have found that out, and I won't go into the details of
Yeah, it's very
how they found
detailed.
it out. Yeah, it's kind of detailed, and we don't really need to know that. But it's established by scholars that one of the starting points is 6,676 BCE. And we also know that when Alexander came to India, some of his historians said that Indians were counting their kings from a legendary character called Dionysus or Bacchus. And
This is
they-
fascinating,
and
though.
he
Isn't Bacchus is Greece, though? This is a Western deity. What's the connection there? How could
Yeah,
Bacchus
so
be in
I was
India?
And that's what I was thinking, that who's this Bacchus? Because the Greek and Roman historians were saying that Indians are counting their kings from 6,776 BC, 100 years prior to the beginning of the Saptarshi calendar. They were counting their kings from this Dionysus, who lived from 6,776 BC at around that time. And then I found an interesting article written by Sir William Jones, who was one of the important scholars of the early 18th century. He said that Bacchus or Dionysus that is no other than Rama, King
Ah,
Rama of Indian legends.
so
And he
Rama,
went into
Rama's bridge, his monkey army, the same Rama is Bacchus. But hang on a second. Dionysus, Bacchus, is the god of revelry, the god of wine and drinking and partying. How does that connect to Rama?
Yeah, that's right. And when Dionysus went to Greece, he basically told them, look, I'm coming from Asia. And this is documented in Greek sources. Look, I'm coming from Asia. And the Greeks always knew that Dionysus was not a Greek by birth.
Right.
The Greeks always knew that Dionysus came to Greece from Asia. And Dionysus says that, look, I've come to Greece after having initiated the whole of Asia into my dances and my rites, through which I might manifest my godhead to them.
Ah.
So he didn't say that this was all party and fun time. He was saying that the reason why he's instituting these dances and these rituals is because through these rituals, you're going to find his godhead. Who is his godhead? So if Rama is Dionysus, then Rama was an ardent devotee of Lord Shiva. He was his main god. It was to Lord Shiva that Rama prayed before he embarked on his battle against Ravana. So Rama, we all know, is a very ardent devotee of Shiva. And when you look at the celebrations of Shiva, there's a celebration called Shiva Ratri, the night of Shiva, when we celebrate the marriage between Shiva and Parvati. So what happens on that night is that a person dresses up as Shiva. He smears himself with ash. He holds a spear in his hand, which symbolizes the trident that Lord Shiva holds. He wears a leopard skin, and he's sitting on a bull. And there's a long procession of people behind him, all of whom, by the way, are drunk,
Oh, wow.
seriously drunk with a drink that we call bhang, which is made of cannabis. And all of them are singing and dancing and moving in a procession. And this is exactly the same scene that you find in the Dionysian retinue, where Dionysus sits on a leopard or a bull. He carries this spear, which is encased in ivy. And the people and the satyrs were part monkeys. who again correspond to the monkey army of Rama. The satyrs and the meaners who are following him, they're all
Of course, yeah. It's the same thing. It's the same celebration. Well, it's not celebration. It's some kind of rite. It's some kind of ritual. And you have the same not quite human, humanoid creatures. That's really incredible. But again, how does that enable you to lock down an anchor? Like, how does that anchor to a date?
Yeah, Rama, we know, lived at the transition period between the Treta Yuga and the Dwapara Yuga. That is between the Silver Age and the Bronze Age. So if Rama lived at the transition period, and if a new Saptarshi cycle started in 6676 BC, which is 100 years after Rama, then my contention was that that must be the date of the beginning of the descending Dwapara Yuga. So 6676 BC must be the Dwapara Yuga in the descending cycle. So as soon as we lock in that date, that's the anchor point that I needed. As soon as you lock in the date, the entire Yuga cycle gets unraveled. And then when you look at it, you find that everything adds up. All the transitional periods add up to the periods of cataclysmic events between the different civilizations. And the beginning of the cycle goes back to 9676 BC, which is right after the ice age ended. So the entire cycle then begins to make sense. So the calendar of the seven sages was basically the missing code. That was the missing portion. And once you figure out that it's basically this Saptarshi cycle, which is used for tracking the Yuga cycle, it all begins to make sense.
It's such a fantastic part of the book because, reading through it, you're right there with you, and you can really feel your enthusiasm at finding this point, because everything starts to come together after this. We understand that for the last 5,700 years, we've been in this Kali Yuga period, and you come to this date, March the 21st, 2025, that'll be followed by this transition period. And I want to talk about that in a moment. But this 2025 date, surely you're not the first person to come across this. Has anyone else in history, looking at ancient civilizations, ancient cycles of time, come forward with 2025 as a date?
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I wanted to figure out, because even though I have put forward a lot of scientific evidence in favor of the Yuga cycle, I also wanted to find some kind of a scriptural confirmation of the timeline. And I found it through two sources. First, it was Alice Bailey. Alice Bailey was one of the important theosophists of the mid 20th century. She was writing at around 1919 to 1945, I think. And she had written around 20 books. And most of her books contain information that was transmitted to her by a Tibetan master called Dwal Khul. And in one of her books, she says that 2025 is the time after which the divine hierarchy will begin to manifest itself. And by divine hierarchy, she meant the evolved supernormal souls, the gods or the angels, who control the evolution of human civilization. So she specifically mentioned 2025 and said that it's after 2025 that this divine hierarchy will start to show itself, which basically means the apocalypse, because the term apocalypse means lifting of the veil. So it's going to be a lifting of the veil between the dimensions, and human beings will realize that we are not the sole occupants of the planet Earth or the solar system, that there are other beings and entities who are also involved in this whole process. That's a big change in our reality. I mean, it's not about the cataclysmic activity. I mean, the destruction of evil, that's obviously an important part. But this whole realization that all of the stories that the ancients handed down to us about the different interdimensional beings, they're not myths and legends. The fact that that it's based on actual truth, that's a huge, enormous change in our reality. And she said,
it'll manifest very clearly. And she spoke about an extraplanetary avatar, didn't she?
Right.
Which is tied into this.
And she also, about 2025, she also said something very important. She said that after the Second World War ended, she wrote that if the forces of light do not join together against the forces of darkness before 2025, then a fiery ordeal is inevitable. That the world will be destroyed by fire.
That's
So,
right. How do you think we're going, Bibhu? Have we got a chance?
I don't see that happening. I mean, there are sporadic and maybe sporadic instances of a kind of fight back, but that's mainly coming from the civil society. We don't see that happening in the larger world, but there's a fight back from the civil society, and people are waking up to the evil that's permeating the world right now, and they're trying to do something about it. But there are two things about it. It's not just the awareness of evil that's important. It's also the awareness of good, the strength and the goodness that lies within us, and to tap into that, because that is ultimately going to uh, kind of help us in this fight. Just the awareness of evil and continuously talking about different kinds of conspiracy theories, that's not really helpful beyond a point. After a point, you also need to manifest the goodness and to use that as a weapon against this evil that is now permeating the globe.
Yeah, I mean, people have to have the courage to not just recognize what is evil, but as you say, actually do something about it. Her source, though, I mean, you're talking about a theosophist. I mean, her sources were, some would argue, metaphysical. You know, some think that the theosophical masters were actual physical beings. It's up for debate. But you know, they claimed that these were Tibetan sources. These were Tibetan masters that were giving them this information. But you ended up finding another correlation to 2025, didn't you, through the Tibetan Kala Chakra Tantra?
That's right.
How did that connect to 2025?
Yeah, since Alice Bailey mentioned that the source of her information was a Tibetan master, I thought that this information must have been known to the Tibetan lamas, and there must be some kind of a textual documentation of this. So I started reading the Kala Chakra Tantra, which is probably the most important text of Tibetan rituals and their history. And the Kala Chakra Tantra says that the current cycle started in 976 BCE, which is the exact date that I had for the ending of the descending Yuga cycle.
Yeah.
So the date exactly matched up. And then they said that after 976 BC, there's going to be a series of 32 kings who will rule in Shambhala. Shambhala is the mystical kingdom where the gods and the highly evolved people reside. And from there, they control the affairs of humanity. And she said that for 3,200 years, these Shambhala kings will rule. 32 kings, each of whom will rule for 100 years, adding up to 3,200 years. And throughout this period, there's going to be a degeneration of human consciousness on Earth. And ultimately, towards the end of this 3,200-year period, there's going to be a king of the barbarians who's going to emerge. And this king of the barbarians is going to get into a fight with the king of Shambhala, who's called Rudra Chakrin. Rudra Chakrin basically means the wrathful one with the wheel. And so there's going to be a fight between the king of Shambhala and the king of the earth, who's the king of the barbarians. And this fight, according to them, is going to happen in 2425, which is like 400 years after 2025. So I was interested because 2425 is not so far away from 2025. So that made me interested. But I was thinking, why isn't it 2025? Because that's the date that Alice Bailey spoke about as well. So then I realized that they made a couple of amendments in the Kala Chakra Tantra.
How far back did you have to go to find the changes?
So they said that instead of 100, the third Kalki king is going to rule for 300 years instead of the usual 100 years. That doesn't make sense. If it's 100 years, it's got to be 100 years for all the kings. So that was clearly a late amendment. And the other amendment is that they're saying that the last age is of 3,200 years duration, which again doesn't make sense because both the Indian and the Persian doctrines, each yuga is of 3,000 years. So you should ideally be having 30 Kalki kings ruling for 100 years each. And then I figured out from one of the sources that what happened is that the name of the Kala Chakra Tantra was translated from the ancient Sanskrit text. And in the ancient Sanskrit text, you actually had 30 kings. But what happened in the process of translation is the name of one king became translated as two kings in the Kala Chakra list. So Hari Vikrama, who was a king in the Sanskrit list, became two kings, Hari and Vikrama. So instead of 30 kings, you ended up with 32 kings.
So that obviously created this extra time.
Extra time of 200 years in the Kala Chakra Tantra.
Right.
So when you take out these late amendments, the Kala Chakra Tantra also points to the year 2025 as the time of the end time battle between the king of the barbarians and Rudra Chakrin, who's the king of Shambhala.
Wow. I'm here for it, Bibhu. I'm ready for the final battle with the king of the law versus the king of the demons. Let's go.
And if you look at the world today, seem to be pretty much heading in that direction.
Yeah.
Although there might be different opinions as to who the king of the barbarians is ultimately going to turn out, because I don't think the battle is going to happen in 2025, because 2025 is just end of the Kali Yuga, which is why the battle is also said to happen in 2025. But it actually takes a bit of time for the end times to kind of unravel itself.
Yeah, we should talk about that. I mean, I had this as a later question for you, but now that we're talking about the date in March 2025, let's be clear about what that means. It's the end of an age, and of course, we have this 300-year transitional period before we enter the next age. The Dwapara. But what exactly do you think we'll see emerge once the curtains finally come down on the Kali Yuga? What kind of changes and manifestations are you predicting we'll start to see in society? Or will it just be continuing decline until there's nothing left, like complete, like the fall of Rome? That's it.
Yeah, actually, when you look back at most of my deductions or most of my predictions are based on what happened in the past. And if you look back at the past, what seems to happen at these Yuga ending periods is that there's always an eruption of war and global battles and violence. And when you look back at the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which are the two Indian epics, we find that in both cases there were big global wars at the end of a Yuga. So this is something that we're also going to face as we move forward. And we can already see that manifesting itself, because a lot of leaders across Europe and across the world are now saying that we are living in the pre-war era. Pre-war era, that's the term that they're using. And I think I read the British defense minister saying that by 2029 or 2030, we might be into the next big global battle. And people everywhere seem to be ramping up their military right now. So we are heading into a period of war, and that kind of a war generally erupts at the end of the Yuga. But this is a war between nations. This is not the war between humans and the gods. That's the second part. And in the first part, maybe till 2030, 2032, you might see this big global war, which might even lead to a nuclear war at some point. Russia is already testing its tactical nuclear weapons. So you might manifest into a big nuclear war by 2030s. And in 2032 and 2036, there are two very important events that's going to happen from the standpoint of the cosmic forces coming into play. Because on those two particular dates, the planet Earth is going to pass through the exact center of the Torid resonance swarm, which is basically a dense swarm of comets and large asteroids, which is circulating within the Torid meteor stream. Now, the Torid meteor stream is the largest meteor stream that we pass through. We pass through the Torids twice in a year, once in May, June. The other is from September to December.
Oh, so that regular.
Yeah. But even though we pass through the stream every year, twice, we don't really pass through the center of this particular swarm of comets.
I see.
Because our paths have to overlap, which doesn't happen often. And very often this swarm actually passes over the Earth. Yeah, that's the diagram.
Yeah, I got it on the screen.
In June and July, we pass through the center of the swarm, through the Torid meteor stream. And in September to December as well, we pass through the meteor stream. And that's when you see this meteors coming in, these blazing meteors, these fireballs, you see them in the sky during these times. But you don't always pass through the center of the swarm, because sometimes the swarm passes over us or under us. And according to the astronomers, British astronomers Clube and Napier, and their collaborators, for instance, Duncan Steele of Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah, he said that every 2,500 to 3,000 odd years, we pass through the center of the swarm. And that's when we get impacted by a volley of meteors and comets over a few centuries, which exactly ties up with the Yuga cycle. Because
yeah, that's amazing. I remember this part in your book because you said you nearly fell out of your chair when you read that.
I know.
This Torid meteor cycle matches perfectly with the 3,000-year ages.
That's right, because I've been searching for a potential answer to this problem for a long time. And I knew that comets and meteor impacts play a very important role, because when I look back at the past transitional periods, I found that all of them were characterized by impact events. And impact events are so powerful because they can set off wildfires, they can set off earthquakes and volcanoes, they can create tsunamis. So the whole destruction by fire and water and earthquakes and volcanoes, all of them can be actually triggered by large impact events. And I was thinking, what is this particular source which is causing these impact events? And the answer to that lies in the Torid resonance swarm. And that's what's causing these impact events. Then when I looked into the ancient legends, I figured that the ancients actually were aware of the Torid meteor stream causing these destructions. And they considered a couple of large comets within this stream were actually respected and venerated by them as their gods, not exactly as their gods, but as the animal mounts of their gods. So,
that's right.
The Vahanas, in Sanskrit we call them Vahanas. What the ancients believed was comets are the messengers of the gods. Comets are sent by the gods to clean and purify the world. Gods don't come themselves to do this cleanup. They simply send these comets as their messengers. And they do the cleanup. And they also seed the earth with new life, because according to the cometary panspermia theory, comets actually bring DNA and RNA molecules and kickstart the process of recreation of the ecosphere at the end of a particular age.
And the army following the gods can be the other meteors, the other objects in the swarm. Yeah, it's fascinating.
If you look at a comet, a lot of comets are actually two-tailed. They have a curving dust tail, and there's an iron tail, which is long and sharp, and it looks like a sword. So a two-tailed comet can be visualized as a man on a horseback moving through the skies and carrying a sword with him, which is how the Kalki avatar of Hinduism has been visualized, and which is also how the second coming of Christ has been visualized, because Christ is also supposed to come on his horse with a sword coming out of his mouth. And Christ is supposed to hold 7 stars in his hand, which obviously refers to the Pleiades constellation. The 7 stars can only refer to the Pleiades constellation. And the meteors of the Torid resonance swarm, they always emanate from the Pleiades constellation.
It's interesting because I was reading through your book again yesterday, and I was on Twitter posting some of the Kali Yuga quotes. And I posted a picture of the Kalki avatar, the guy riding on the horse with his sword, representing, he's coming at the end of the Kali Yuga and taking care of all the wickedness and evil. And I posted this, and someone that follows me replied, "I'm a Catholic. This is a cult. Like this is ridiculous," and blocked me. And I was trying to reply to him just before he blocked me, and I was going to say to him, "No, this is how it is in Christianity. It's the same archetype. He's coming back on a horse. Jesus is coming back on a horse. He's got the same sword. It's the same archetype. It's from your religion as well." But of course, I couldn't reply because he'd already blocked me. But yeah, it's fascinating how these archetypes all match. So you're saying that the Kalki avatar is actually representing a celestial body that is going to come into close contact with the Earth.
Yeah, see, what seems to be happening is that these comets within the Torid resonance swarm, right now they are in a dormant state. which means they're not giving out the gases which make them so effulgent and brilliant. So right now they're dark and dormant, and which is why we don't see them in the skies right now. But before we pass through the Torid resonance swarm in the years 2032 and 2036, there's a very high probability that these comets are going to become active. And when a comet becomes active, it actually becomes enormous in size. It spans millions of years. Each of the tails of a comet, they extend for millions of millions of light years. So, what am I saying? Not millions of light years, millions of miles.
Yes.
So they're very long, the cometary tails, and the iron tail is filled with charged particles. The blue iron tail is filled with charged particles, and if that iron tail moves over the surface of the Earth, it can basically set everything on fire. So comet does not even have to hit us with debris. It can just pass close to the Earth with this iron tail sweeping over the Earth, and you have everything on fire.
So it doesn't have to be an impact. It's just got to come close enough.
If it just comes close enough, that's going to not only change the face of our planet in terms of the physical structures, but the energy balance is going to change drastically. I mean, you can imagine such a big effulgent object coming close to the Earth. It's going to fundamentally change the energy balance of the planet. And what the ancients used to say is that whenever a comet comes close to the Earth, not only does it cause a lot of hardships in terms of destruction of kingdoms and famines and pestilences, but it also creates an onset of a period of war. People kind of it creates a frenzy of violence in the minds of people. So basically, people are not able to handle those energies of the comet, and they kind of turn violent. So if these comets get activated and if they come close to the Earth, then it can basically trigger that end time battle that's mentioned in so many ancient texts.
It's interesting you mentioned burning there. That's probably a good segue into wrapping up this discrepancy between the 24,000-year Yuga cycle and the 25,920-year precession cycle. You were able to marry the two ultimately through these almost hidden periods that emerged. Can you speak a little bit about that, how you got them to match in the end, how you discovered that they actually match?
I'll talk about it very briefly. Basically, the Greeks spoke about two periods of transition, which were much longer than the 300 periods of transition between the Yugas. So they said that at the end of the Golden Age, you have a period called cataclysmos, when the world is destroyed by water and ice. And at the end of the Iron Age, or the Kali Yuga, you have a period of ekpyresis, which when the world is destroyed by fire. Now, I found out that there was a period called the Younger Dryas period, which extended from around 10,876 BC till around 9,676 BC. For a period of 1,200 years, the temperatures had plummeted to near glacial conditions. All over the world, temperatures had declined by nearly 12 to 15 degrees Celsius. So the glaciers had again become as big as they were at the end of the Ice Age, around 20,000 years ago. So that was the period of cataclysmos that the Greeks were talking about. And it extended for 1,200 years. We know that.
Wow.
We have that data, which means the end of the Kali Yuga should also be followed by a period of ekpyresis extending for 1,200 years. So when you add these two periods of 1,200 years to the Yuga cycle, all of a sudden you find that the total duration of the cycle is 25,800 years, which is exactly the same as the duration of the precession cycle. So
yes,
I was
it's
totally
very
amazed.
neat.
I was totally amazed when I found this out, because it totally matches up with the precession cycle. And this piece of information about ekpyresis and cataclysms, I wasn't aware of that when I first wrote about the Yuga cycle. But now it seems to make perfect sense, because the Golden Age couldn't have ended when the Younger Dryas period was going on. The Golden Age must have ended prior to the beginning of the Younger Dryas period, because the Golden Age is the time of peace and plenty.
Yeah.
And so this 1,200 period of Younger Dryas must have started after the Golden Age had ended. So that makes perfect sense. And so after the Kali Yuga, we are basically going into a period of 1,200 years of transition. It's not going to be, it's not 300 years as I initially thought.
And so the term is ekpyrosis, pyro. That means fire, right?
Yeah.
Great.
So it's destruction by fire this time instead of water and ice. It's not going to be the big flood anymore. It's going to be the big burning.
So we can't build a boat. We can't build an ark. It's funny because in your book, you put in some of the common questions that you get about this. I think one of them was, how do we prepare? And, you also included some commentary surrounding this from the Native American cultures that believe that this is coming, where people kind of say, well, do I build a shelter? Do I keep collecting food? And it kind of misses the point, doesn't it? I mean, how do you prepare for the Kali Yuga, the fall of the Kali Yuga?
I mean, that's a big question. And the thing is that when you're ending a yuga and you have an idea of where you're heading, I think the logical thing is to tune out of this particular yuga, tune out of the decaying energies of the Kali Yuga, and try to tune into the energies of the yuga that is on the way. And the yuga that is on the way is basically the ascending cycle. And the ascending cycle is about love and oneness and unity. It's no longer about divisions and hatred and about materialism. It is about enhancing or uplifting your spiritual consciousness. So that's what we need to do. We need to get in touch with our inner divinity, with our self or our soul, so that we reflect the virtues of the soul. And a person who starts to tune into his inner divinity, he automatically lives in dharma. And dharma is the basis of the Yuga cycle. The reason why we fell from the golden age to the Kali Yuga is because of a decline in dharma or righteousness. So when you start living in tune with your inner divinity, then you are automatically living in dharma. Then you automatically become eligible to, move into the next cycle. And
yeah. It's an interesting choice of word, eligible, because when you look back at the various different cultures and these ends of the ages, the Hopi come to mind with the good people being saved. And this isn't just some, it's tempting to think of this as some kind of mechanism in a universe that works like a machine, and this kind of comes through as a machine. But the reality is that the universe has mind and consciousness and God. And this is something that is, I feel, is it a plan? It's a direct plan. It's something that is created for human beings, which actually brings to mind another interesting question that he included in this kind of FAQ, these questions that you've got over the years. And it was a great question. Why would human beings need to go through this? What is the benefit of going through a cycle like this and these ups and downs and going through such a grand tribulation like the fall of the Kali Yuga?
Well, because, you have these cycles everywhere. Just as we have these cycles of day and night, you also have this cycle of the yugas. And the reason being, we need to learn not only from the golden age, but also from the Kali Yuga. Because in the Kali Yuga, it's all the more difficult for you to maintain your equanimity in the face of violence, to tune into your inner consciousness, even though there are so many distractions around you. In Kali Yuga, you have to practice a lot of forgiveness because there's so much crime around you and you can't be violent all the time. So these are the kind of virtues that you develop in a Kali Yuga, which you can't develop in the higher yugas when life is so much better and everybody is saintly. You don't develop those qualities in a higher yuga. So Kali Yuga is also a great teacher. He teaches us all those things that you don't learn in a higher yuga. Although we don't like this particular teacher. I mean, he's like, he's like Snape. He's like Snape.
It's a pretty strict one.
Yeah, very strict one. And but yeah, it teaches us those lessons that you don't learn in the higher yugas.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, when I was tweeting about it yesterday, a lot of the comments are, why am I alive in such a time period? How cruel is it that I have to go through this, that I'd be alive right now? And I kind of look at those comments and think, well, you're missing the point, because it really is an opportunity, as you say.
Right.
When you're surrounded by such terrible evil and inversions of the world, it gives you a great opportunity to come through this as someone who doesn't succumb to the forces of the Kali Yuga. What does that say about your character? If you can come through it and turn to the old ways, to the gods and the righteous old ways of our ancestors, you really have resisted the forces of the Kali Yuga. So again, I look at it as this really special opportunity. I think we're really we're really lucky to be alive in this time period.
Exactly. I think that as well, because I think we have all made a choice to be here at this moment. And that's because of two reasons. First of all, to fight against these distractions and this evil, and to manifest our better selves, to become our best selves, even in the face of so much violence and distraction. And the second is that we are going to witness something that happens only once in Yuga cycle, because this is not only just the end of the Kali Yuga, but this is the end of the entire descending cycle of consciousness that began in 9676 BCE. So this is one half of the Yuga cycle that is coming to an end. And this is a big deal. And to be incarnated at this point in time, and to also be able to play our own individual roles in this whole unfolding and this manifestation, I think this is a blessing, and this should be looked upon as a blessing. And we should try to make use of our internal resources instead of, just complaining and feeling, victimized, because that's very easy to do. To feel victimized is very easy to do. And people say, this happened to me and that happened to me. You don't know what went on in my life. I'm like, it doesn't matter what went in your life. You have to let that go, because that's not what you're here for. You have to understand what you're here for, and you have to manifest that soul purpose, and you have to live that soul purpose. That's what you should be doing, instead of complaining about all the bad things that have happened to you, because bad things have happened to everyone. Believe it or not. Yeah.
Well said, Bibhu. Well said. And I think that's a great positive message to finish this interview on. And I know I've taken up a lot of your time this afternoon, but I really appreciate you coming and talking about the new book, Yuga Shift, The End of the Kali Yuga, An Impending Planetary Transformation. It's available now. I'll link to it in the show notes at mysteriousuniverse.org. Congratulations. It is just fantastic research. We didn't even get a chance to talk about a lot of the scientific evidence that you've included, and I might talk about that on an upcoming Mysterious Universe show, these changes in the cranial capacity descending down through the yugas as well. You did such a great job with that. But yeah, pleasure to have you on the show. And are you working on anything else?
Yeah, I'm already working on my next book. I hope I can bring it out before the Kali Yuga ends. I don't know.
That's your deadline. You got to get it out before the end of the world.
Right. I mean, I don't know how long things will last like this. I mean,
yeah, that's a great point. Well, the pressure's on, Bibhu. You got to get off the call and go hit the books. But thanks again. Thank you so much for joining us. And you can catch Bibhu on our website, of course, at mysteriousuniverse.org, and bibhudevmisra.com is the website. So Bibhu, thanks again.
Thanks, Ben, for having me.
Huge thanks again to Bibhu for appearing on the show. Make sure you check out his new book, Yuga Shift. It's available now on Amazon. We'll link to it in the show notes at mysteriousuniverse.org. And again, his website is bibhudevmisra.com. I'll put it on the screen there. It's got a bunch of interesting stuff, including, we mentioned in the interview, Alice Bailey, the old theosophist. She came to the same date. And I don't know about this 2025 date. It's awfully close.
It's very close.
It's funny, he said in the interview that when he first thought that this 2025 date was the one, he discovered that a while ago. So he was like, that's a fair way in the future.
So what, has he been in denial about it? Just putting it at the back of his mind?
It was just a possibility. And now when he finally puts it all together and nails it down and realizes, it's March 2025, it's literally a year away.
Look, we need some type of change. I don't know if a complete global destruction and transformation is the way through it, but maybe a little change. So maybe let's keep our hopes up that it might be okay.
You've got to stay positive.
Yeah.
It's all about the challenge of going through the Kali Yuga. It's all about the trial and the tribulation. And if you come through the Kali Yuga as someone who is uncorrupted, you're not completely transformed by the declining age. What does that say about you?
That's true. Yeah.
It's the ultimate challenge. Well, so I'm enjoying it.
One such person who sadly has passed on now, but is highly likely to have been able to get through such a transformation, is Dixie Yeterian. Now, she is the author of Casebook of a Psychic Detective, and she is a really fascinating woman. Now, in a couple of shows, 3-4 weeks ago, we were diving into psychic detectives, right? And it happened that I came across Dixie's story, And I thought, I need to find more details about this woman. She has had incredible encounters as a reluctant psychic detective. And in our Plus extension, I'm going to go into those experiences. And there's this real cherry on the top that I found at the last minute today that I could not find any validating evidence for whatsoever until I found this obscure news article that shows that this woman has been to hell and back, and her abilities appear to be real.
Really?
Yeah, there's something truly incredible about her. So that's coming up in our Plus extension right after this.
Yeah, you told me that you have some very unique psychometry coming up.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I thought it was a bit crass to put it into the headlines that we're going to be going into air psychometry, but we really are going to do arse psychometry in a moment. Well, we're not personally going to do arse psychometry, but Dixie does a couple of times, and that is coming up in our Plus.
Yeah, awesome. Looking forward to that. Well, if you want to get access, head to mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Sign up today. You get access to the big extensions we do on these shows every single Friday. And of course, Plus members get an entirely exclusive show every single Tuesday as well. Again, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Sign up today. And if you sign up for MU Max, you get access to our entire back catalogue going back 16 plus years. So tons of benefits to being a member. Sign up today, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. That's a wrap for this free edition of the show. Thanks for listening. If you're on Plus, stick around for the great stuff after the break. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week.